Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for episode 714 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and in this episode, I am looking forward to re-sharing our conversation with our guest, Dr. Christy Haynes, initially published on April 3rd of 2017. Listeners, Christy is conducting fascinating research at the intersection of nanoscience, environmental science, and immunology. Her research has involved developing new, safe nanoparticles for a wide range of applications, such as healthcare and sustainable energy. They also monitor small amounts of important chemicals in complex environments, such as cells, to help evaluate the impacts of nanoparticles in consumer products. And in our conversation, Christy shared wonderful stories from her life and research. So listeners, sit back, relax, and get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Christy Haynes. So, Christy, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. How's it going?
It's going well. It's nice to be here. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, we are delighted to have you with us today and excited to learn more about your work and your career. But before we dive into those details, I want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you. So, listeners, Christy is the Elmore H. Northey Professor of Chemistry at the University of Minnesota. She completed her undergraduate studies in chemistry at Macalester College and received her master's and PhD in chemistry from Northwestern University. Next, Christy was awarded a National Institutes of Health National Research Service Award Post-Doctoral Fellowship to conduct research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota in 2005. Now, Christy has received many awards and honors for her research, including the Sara Evans Faculty Women Scholar Leader Award, the Taylor Award for Distinguished Research from the University of Minnesota, the Kavli Foundation Emerging Leader in Chemistry Lectureship, the Pittsburgh Conference Achievement Award, the Joseph Black Award from the Royal Society of Chemistry, an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, the Arthur F. Findeis Award for Achievements by a Young Analytical Scientist from the American Chemical Society, Division of Analytical Chemistry, the Society for Electroanalytical Chemistry Young Investigator Award, the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Teacher Scholar Award, the NIH New Innovator Award, an NSF CAREER Award, and also the Victor K. Lemur Award from the American Chemical Society, Division of Colloid and Surface Science. The list could go on and on here. In addition, Christy has been recognized for her excellence in mentoring through receipt of the Advising and Mentoring Award and also the Outstanding Postdoctoral Mentor Award, both from the University of Minnesota. She has also been listed among the top 100 inspiring women in STEM from Insights into Diversity magazine, also the Analytical Scientist Top 40 Under 40 Power List, and one of the Brilliant 10 chosen by Popular Science magazine. And listeners, Christy is here with us today to talk about her experiences in life and science. So Christy, we cannot wait to learn more about your life and your science. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not busy doing research?
Yeah, sure. When I'm not working, most of the time, you will find me with my two kids. So I have a 5-year-old little girl and a just about to turn 9-year-old little boy. And parenting is something I really enjoy. It's also a really time-consuming activity. When not doing that, you would most likely find me out for a run around one of the gorgeous lakes here in Minneapolis.
That's awesome. So 5 and 9 are both fun ages. What are their favorite activities these days?
They like everything. My big kid is more kind of analytical and sciencey, but also super competitive and sportsy. And my little one is really into art and music. And you can't get her to do anything she doesn't want to do. She is very...
We'll say independent. Yeah. So now, do you dabble in art and music yourself?
I don't, although my spouse is a musician. I mean, I enjoy music and dancing and things, but I don't practice any of those things actively.
Gotcha. Well, wonderful to get a window into your life outside of science. But I want to chat a little bit about your scientific life next. So, Christy, can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who's not at all familiar with your work or your field?
It's funny when you ask this question because I first have to orient myself that I'll describe what my research group does. Of course, what I actually do in my job isn't just the research component, right? I also teach and I have a lot of leadership roles, but I'll focus on research because I think that's probably what the listeners would be most interested in.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of research focus, I'd say that my research group, which has about 20 people in it, graduate students, undergraduates, and postdocs, mostly pursues two major goals. So first, either to develop new measurement methods to monitor small quantities of important chemicals in complex environments, or the second thing, to develop new, safe nanomaterials for applications that are relevant in human health or sustainable energy applications.
Very cool. Well, your research sounds phenomenal. I know that's more fun sometimes than talking about all the administrative things we do as faculty members. So
the administrative stuff is important too.
Definitely.
Right. People that are thinking about science that are also thinking about how you structure departments and colleges and universities so that the best science can be done. So I participate in both.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to chat more about your work as we go through this interview. But Christy, I do want to pause here for a moment to talk about motivation. I think there are lots of different things that you're doing, lots of different hats you're wearing as a scientist, and it can be hard to keep up with it all. So I'm always on the lookout for fun little sayings, quotes, things that will keep me going in my day. So do you have a favorite of your own?
I do. I thought about this ahead of this interview, and I've ended up coming up with something that's actually a quote of my own, inspired a little bit by the fact that I really love TED Talks, and I have gone to the big TED meeting, and I've thought a lot about if I were to give a TED Talk, what would I want my message to be? And that kind of forces you to succinctly kind of nail down something you care about. And so my motivational quote would be, prove them right. In this case, the them includes the people that have faith in you or have made opportunities available, and the motivational quote is meant to push people, especially junior people or women, past the imposter syndrome that often holds them back.
Definitely. So aside from this quote, is there anything that has really helped you get over this imposter syndrome, or is this something that you've struggled with?
I think it's fair to say that I have struggled with this. I had spent a lot of years, even years into the tenure track, waiting for people to discover that they made the wrong hire or that I wasn't really supposed to be here or that I wasn't really a scientist. Mm-hmm. One way I get over it is by helping more junior people recognize it in themselves. Sometimes you learn things when you're teaching them to other people.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to kind of walk the walk and listen to the advice you give to other people. And so I think actually working with junior scientists helps me in my own development. That sounds more selfish than I mean it to sound, but...
Sure. I'm sure it helps both sides.
Yeah.
Well, now, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about some of these people who might have helped you when you were a young scientist, or if there were any role models or people that you really looked up to as you were starting your career.
The best person I can come up with was when I was at Macalester College as an undergraduate. Macalester is a small liberal arts school, which is a great setting for me because I was a first-generation college student, and so it was nice to maybe be in just a slightly smaller, kind of more tight-knit community. But I had this really great undergraduate organic chemistry professor. Her name was Rebecca Hoy. And I'm not an organic chemist, but she was brilliant and approachable and had hobbies and had small children. And it was really important for me, I think, to see this as a possibility. It was a model that I could authentically aspire to follow. So I still speak with her sometimes. Macalester is actually right down the road from the University of Minnesota. And she continues to inspire me now.
Certainly. So I know you were interested in chemistry when you were already in college. Is there a point earlier in your life when you started getting interested in science and chemistry, or is there a particular memory that really shows when this all sparked for you?
I think I don't follow the traditional trajectory here. As I was growing up, I really didn't grow up intending to be a scientist. I didn't know any scientists. I wasn't the kid who took apart all the clocks and radios in the house to see how they worked. Overall, I was a hardworking student, and I generally got good grades. Actually, it's a good story. So I went to my first day of high school chemistry, and the teacher was this great, really dynamic guy. And he was up at the front of the room trying to impress the class, and he did a big combustion reaction. I was actually a pyrophobe, and I was kind of terrified. And of course, I was sitting in the front row because I was that kind of kid.
Right. Me too.
And I left that class really wondering what I was doing there. But I went back the second day, and the second day we watched this video about careers in chemistry. And I really clearly remember this little vignette where there was this woman in this hazmat suit wading through a lake of toxic waste. And she was taking samples to go back to the lab to figure out how chemistry could help clean up that environmental mess. And I was really inspired by the potential power of chemistry at that point. And I think I also chose it for some very pragmatic reasons. I could imagine what a job would look like, and I felt like it would have the potential to make the world a better place. And I will say that first-generation college students tend to choose things that look like they will convert directly into a job. And so I went to college and just kind of head down, barreled through a chemistry major. And I actually graduated from college in 3 years, not because I was super smart, but because I couldn't really afford a fourth year.
Gotcha.
And so I think I was very unlikely to change my major just by virtue of the fact that I was pushing. Actually, I should say, while I was an undergraduate, I worked in an undergraduate kind of research project. I TA'd. I worked at 3M as a technical aide. And so I saw just how diverse the applications of chemistry were, and I saw how much freedom you would have in that field. Chemistry is often touted as, quote unquote, the central science. And so there's certainly lots of opportunities that come with that being your core. When I started as an undergraduate at Macalester, I didn't even really know what graduate school was. I certainly wasn't thinking of that as an option for myself. But my undergraduate advisor said, oh, you should go to graduate school. And when I found out that you go and you don't take out more loans, that they actually pay you to TA as a graduate student, I could hardly believe that somebody was going to pay me.
Yeah, it's a sweet deal. Yeah.
At the degree that I wanted. So I barreled right through after 3 years at Macalester to grad school at Northwestern. And from there, found an advisor that was really inspired about going after big ideas and didn't feel bound by the perceived limitations of what technology could do. And he really gave me a lot of freedom in terms of ideas I pursued. And while I wasn't super confident that I knew what I was doing, once you get a little taste of success, you put an idea out there and it's successful, that's really self-reinforcing. And so I had an amazing graduate school career. I went to all of these conferences. I started to figure out what the scientific community was like. I published way more papers than I ever thought I would. And so I had just this really great experience as a graduate student. Even then, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do after graduate school, I was thinking that I wanted to teach because I really loved TAing and I really loved mentoring undergraduates. But I thought I wanted to go back to primarily undergraduate institution like Macalester because Rebecca Hoy, she'd had this like beautiful life balance. And I thought, oh, I want that. But my PhD advisor had really strong opinions about the fact that he thought that I could hack it at a top tier school. And he encouraged me to apply. And so I did a very unusual thing. I actually applied for faculty jobs when I was still a fourth year graduate student.
Oh, really?
In chemistry, usually you don't apply to the end of your postdoc, but I had a lot of papers published and I didn't really expect to get a job. I kind of wanted just to have a couple of universities have a good impression of me and be looking for my quote unquote real application in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. But as it turns out, I did 5 interviews and got 4 jobs. And I told them that I wasn't going to start till after I did a postdoc. So technically, I started my postdoc at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with my faculty job already lined up, which is a pretty nice way to do a postdoc.
Yeah.
Because then you don't spend the whole time
frantically searching for jobs. Yeah.
Strategizing for how you're going to get a job. It was more like a sabbatical in a way. And so I did my postdoc in an area that was really scientifically orthogonal to what my graduate work was. There was almost no overlap content-wise. And I could do that because I had this kind of freedom that went with already knowing where I was going. And it set me up with, I think, a really interesting skill set. So not the usual trajectory where I knew from the time I was 4 that I wanted to be a chemist, but lots of good things that have kept pointing me in this direction.
Well, I think that is an amazing strategy, hearing about how you approach this job search situation. So can you tell me, was there any, I guess, frustration from the universities offering you a job that you weren't ready to start right then?
No. So I only applied to a small number of schools, again, because I didn't really think they would take it that seriously. And in the cover letter I sent, I was really clear that even though it was 2002 when I was applying, I was looking for a fall 2005 start date. And pretty much what I was hedging my bets on there is that if anybody was interested, most big departments are willing to wait if there's somebody that meets a need that they need to meet. And the truth is, if you're speaking frankly at top tier research institutions for chemistry departments, there are not that many women. We are in very small numbers. And so I think if you have a strong candidate that's in an underrepresented group, in a way, there's almost no reason not to wait. Most big departments aren't going to hire a tenure track faculty member for a class they need to teach the next fall, right? They're thinking much more long term.
Right.
So that's a nice thing about looking at big departments. There was one school, I'll say, that I applied to that I never heard from until I was almost done with my search. I actually had offers on the table. I was making decisions. And then they contacted me and they said, oh, we aren't really hiring this year, but we just realized from your cover letter, you're actually looking for a few years from now. Will you come out and interview? And I ended up not doing that interview because I was already kind of too far down the road with other things.
Right.
Happy with my options. So I didn't really end up with a lot of trouble because I was in this non-traditional path. I'll say I've done a lot of things at not quite the usual timing.
Well, I think that's a good strategy to share with our listeners as a potential opportunity they could consider if they're a strong candidate coming out of graduate school to just start putting those feelers out there.
I think it's also good advice for faculty at current departments that are thinking about how you get a more diverse professoriate is to think about investing some time and some energy in getting to know the nearing end of grad school stars, because if you make an investment in them kind of intellectually and time-wise, you have a better chance of hiring them, whether they're ready then or a few years later. So I think it's good advice on both sides, actually.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Christy. And I'm really glad your view of chemistry improved substantially after that traumatic, explosive incident in chemistry your first year.
Well, I can tell you with a little bit of irony that now one of the biggest outreach events I do is called Energy in You, and it's this gigantic hour-long show for 3rd through 6th graders. We bus kids in from all over the state of Minnesota. We see about 14,000 kids a year, and the show is set to music, and it's full of explosions, and I do this every year, and I love it, actually. So I have overcome that initial first day of chemistry trauma and kind of come full circle. Hopefully I'm not traumatizing any more future chemists.
Yeah. So when did this event start? This sounds really cool.
Yeah. So I have a couple colleagues named David Blank and Mark Hillmeyer that wanted to do a little chemistry outreach thing. It used to be very simple, like in our lecture hall, and they kind of hammed it up while they did some demos. It was all very improvisational. And then they realized that there were some kids that were being reached that essentially the University of Minnesota wasn't reaching otherwise, that maybe weren't getting the best exposure to science or chemistry in their classrooms. And so they asked me if I would get involved, maybe in part because they wanted to have a woman as one of the presenters. And I think that it's actually really important that when you have this classroom full of 3rd through 6th grade boys and girls, that they see people that look like them in the front of the room represented as a chemist. And so now it's gotten really formalized. We have formal sponsors, and we've actually now started working with the drama department to handle like lighting and sound, even better collaboration I never thought I would have. It's a really fun outreach event, and we specifically try to reach kids that are in schools that have large percentages of free and reduced lunch population or large underrepresented groups in science typically. And while we see 14,000 kids a year, we have 10,000 kids still on our waiting list. So it's a really popular program. And while I think the science part of it is really important, I actually kind of think that the more important piece is, so we pay to bus them to the university. And I think about how impactful it would have been for me when I was that age to even be able to picture what it meant to be at a university. I wonder how much easier that would have made it for me to think about myself in college. And so I think there's this impact about scientific awareness, but I think there's also a big impact about kids picturing themselves as college students and picturing themselves as belonging on a campus and in certain fields.
Well, this is phenomenal, Christy. Thank you so much for telling us about this program, this wonderful outreach event. And I do want to talk a little bit more about what you have going on in your own scientific program these days. So is there a particular project you have ongoing right now that you are so excited about that you want to share some detail on?
My group actually works on a broad variety of things, but something that I have been spending a lot of time thinking about is not a project that's just in my group alone. I work a lot of big collaborations. Specifically, my group is part of a large National Science Foundation funded research center known as the Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology. And the goal of all the scientists that make up this center is to discover design rules that determine the molecular level interactions between engineered nanoparticles and biological systems. So engineered nanoparticles are just tiny bits of matter, but they have really exciting chemical and physical properties. And so they're being used more and more commonly in consumer products, and especially in a lot of products that you would consider kind of sustainable products, solar cells, for example. One type of material that we're really focused on in this center that my group is working on are the nanoparticles that will make up the majority of the next generation lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. So these materials are going to be used in large volumes. Predictions suggest that there'll be about 20 million electric vehicles on the road by 2020, and each one of their batteries contains about 40 kilograms of these nanoscale particles. And so while it's super exciting that there will be more electric vehicles on the road, there's actually very little known about the safety of these enabling nanomaterials at the end of their life. There's very little recycling infrastructure for the materials. And so in the center, my group is exploring how slight changes in this nanoscale materials, chemical composition or morphology can really change how toxic the materials are to critical components of the ecosystem, like bacteria. So I'm excited about this. You can see it mimics that story from my second day in high school chemistry, because essentially what we can think about is having proactive rather than reactive nanomaterial design so that we have maximal beneficial impacts, for example, with electric vehicles, with minimal unintended consequences. And I mentioned the center, and people listening might picture a center as a bricks and mortar kind of building full of people. And that's not what this center is. It's actually a center across 12 different institutions with 16 different faculty and a total of about 80 researchers. And so it's a super broad, diverse, exciting collaboration. And the nanoscale battery materials are just one aspect of that work, but it's something that I'm excited about.
Absolutely. So I know this field of nanotoxicology is relatively new in the scheme of scientific fields. Can you tell us a little bit about, is it just predominantly these more energy sources that are a concern, or are there other toxicology implications for other nanomaterials?
No, the implications are broad. So the reason nanoparticles are really exciting, of course, is because by making the elements that we've traditionally thought of as metals or nonmetals or conductive things or non-conductive things, when you make them nanoscale, you essentially get a whole new set of properties. So we get this whole new dimension on the periodic table, which is great because it means we can do a lot of really innovative things with nanomaterials. It also means, of course, that they may react different from a toxicological or an environmental safety perspective. And so you can find engineered nanomaterials in many applications beyond electric vehicle batteries. Certainly, there's at least 20 FDA-approved formulations for drugs that contain nanoparticles, many more in clinical trials. You will find nanoparticles in the monitor of your computer or your phone, for example. There are lots of nanoparticles in lots of places. And so that's why we can't really think about this as a one-off where we pick one type of nanomaterial and test it in one set of ecological or biological systems for toxicity. That's actually why this large center effort is needed, because we need to take a much broader perspective. If we had to test every nanoparticle in every organism, I mean, that's a completely intractable problem.
Right.
So instead, we need to think broadly about what's the chemistry that rules those interactions so that we can think about how to control it from a chemical perspective, and then hopefully have something that's generalizable across materials and across kind of biological systems.
Wonderful. Well, great to hear more about these projects that you are so excited about. And it sounds like this is just a really phenomenal area of the field to be in, because it's sort of exploding in a lot of different directions right now.
It is. And actually, I told you on my kind of non-traditional path to this position. In a way, the reason I'm doing nanotoxicology, the field pretty much was emerging right as I was starting my individual faculty career. I wasn't aware of it for sure. I wasn't paying attention to toxicology journals. But as a graduate student, I worked on nothing biological. I worked on making noble metal nanoparticles and doing some surface spectroscopy. It was very physical chemistry. And then when I did this very orthogonal postdoc, I was doing single cell measurements in neurons, and I was learning about electrochemistry. And so there was this kind of beautiful moment when I realized I could bring together everything I learned about making and characterizing and controlling nanoparticles for all these potential applications with understanding how those nanoparticles might influence the biological system or the biological cells that I've been studying. And so it was interesting, by creating this unique skill set fortuitously, I suppose, I ended up at this place that just happened to be emerging as an important topic. So I think that's a good testament to developing an unusual skill set. It positions you to go after questions that maybe not everybody else can go after.
Certainly. And I think these interdisciplinary approaches, like you're describing, are really the future of where a lot of science is going these days.
I absolutely agree. They're the problems I love the most, for sure. I will often tell people that I don't fit very neatly into one of the standard chemistry boxes. You usually think about people as being organic chemists or physical chemists. And while you could put me kind of in some of those boxes, I'm much happier being seated between them.
Gotcha. Well, great to hear more about what's going on in your laboratory, in your research, and in this phenomenal sounding center. But I want to talk a little bit next about some of the challenges. I think, Christy, we've talked about a lot of the exciting elements of your career and your work, but I know every scientist has days, maybe weeks, maybe months even, where it just seems like everything is going wrong. So can you take us back to one of these times of your own where you were really struggling with something, or maybe had a major failure, and tell us how you worked through this tough time?
Like every scientist, I certainly had periods, especially when I was a graduate student and a postdoc, where experiments weren't working, right? Things that you thought were going to be the answer to some experimental problem really just don't pan out. I would say those struggles don't affect me as much as the ones that involve people. So this job as a faculty member is partly, of course, about coming up with scientific ideas. But I would say even more, at least for me, it's about working with the people that are actually executing the science at the bench I would say my biggest struggle has been a very difficult personnel situation, I would say. I won't share many details, but one thing that's lovely about this job is that you spend your whole career working with people that are right on the precipice of making huge decisions about the rest of their life, right? People in their early and mid-20s that are excited about everything and super hard workers and making these big decisions. The downside to that is that this is also an age where things like depression and mental illness can emerge. Mm-hmm. And so somebody who works closely with people, I had this really bright, hardworking, productive student who transitioned really suddenly to being unproductive and difficult and intimidating even. And I think I made some mistakes here. I spent a long time thinking that I could essentially mentor this person out of this mental state that required very different expertise than I provide. And so in a group like mine where collaboration and shared energy is really critical, I would say this difficult situation took a huge emotional toll on me and my research group. And I will say that despite that, my group really banded together, supporting each other and supporting me. My colleagues in the department were really supportive. And the situation appears to have passed, I'll say, but I would be lying if I said I don't still worry about it sometimes. So I guess what I would say overall is the hardest thing is I think the hardest struggles are the personnel ones. I expect experiments to fail. I expect projects to fail. That, I think, is just a normal part of the scientific process, right? But people struggles are much harder for me to just kind of tolerate and get past. I worry a lot more about that.
Definitely. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate is that science is a human enterprise. And these aren't the kinds of challenges you prepare yourself for or anticipate that you'll face as a scientist. So what were some of the things you mentioned, having supportive colleagues and the supportive lab environment that helped you? Did you seek any other resources that helped you get through it?
Absolutely. That would have been really irresponsible for me not to seek other resources. Certainly one thing you have to realize in all of these situations is your own limitations. I think that sometimes we want to help people so badly, we want to do everything. But no, I absolutely went to the university people that needed to be involved, the health services and conflict resolution and our director of graduate studies, and went through lots of steps to try to figure out how to make things work. It was a long process, probably longer than it should have been. But no, I don't kid myself. I am certainly not a psychiatrist or a therapist.
Right.
And if I think I am, then I'm doing myself and that student a disservice. But one thing that you do have a responsibility as an advisor to do is to make sure you know where those other resources are and to check up on people and make sure that they're following through with them. And at some point, of course, I'm working with a whole group of adults. You can lead a horse to water, right? But you can't make them drink. And so it's also accepting that limitation sometimes, that you can really want something for somebody, whether it's mental health or a job, but they have to want it too. And that's a really interesting thing to learn how to accept as an advisor, whether it's a situation like the one I described, or just if you have a great student who is brilliant and talented and could compete at the highest echelon, but they decide that that's not really what drives them or what they want, you have to be okay with that.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a really important story to share for our listeners, to put this on people's radar. I think it kind of goes both ways, whether you're a student listening right now, thinking about some of the challenges you're facing or some of the challenges you'll face in the future, but also if you're thinking about it from the mentorship aspect and what things you could do if you find yourself in this situation, or if there's someone who you know right now who's struggling, thinking about some of the resources you could connect them with.
Yeah, and I don't think that's exactly the kind of struggle you were probably looking for. I could certainly describe how some of the original proposals I wrote as part of my faculty application, I had one of my first graduate students pursue one of them for 2 full years before we realized that it pretty much was not technologically possible yet.
Oh, no.
Yeah, to switch projects completely. So there are also those kinds of struggles. But honestly, in the grand scheme of things, I think those are less important and actually a healthy part of the scientific process.
Definitely. Well, I love hearing the wide variety of responses I get. So you hear a lot of things like the science is failing, but there's personal struggles, there's interpersonal struggles. So I love being able to share all of those stories. But we don't just want to dwell on the tough times here, Christy. I want you to share with us next a story of your own of success, one of these high points in your career that meant a lot to you, even if it was just a small victory.
There are so many. You read this very long list of awards for me, and none of those are expected, and all of them are high points. There's some really amazing recognition, and some of the rewards for research directions you can pursue when you get those awards are great. I'll actually pick something to be a little bit more detailed about that was just in this last week, just for currency. Mm-hmm. Just this week, actually on Wednesday at 1:00, a piece of collaborative work was published in the journal Science Translational Medicine. And so if you're not in the field, if you're uninitiated, this is a fancy journal and not a place that I often publish. It's not a chemistry journal per se. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal to get a paper published here. And essentially, the content of this work is that nanoparticles that my group makes, not related to the battery materials I mentioned earlier, but for a totally different purpose, essentially made it possible to re-warm vitrified tissue. So to be clear, when somebody donates an organ, as a society, we're really good at freezing things. We're very capable of vitrifying it so that there aren't ice crystals in there or anything. We're not very good at rewarming tissue. If you put it in a water bath or if you heat it up in a microwave, of course, the outside thaws before the inside and then the tissue is damaged. And so that's why we don't hold organs and ship them to the best possible match on the planet, right? That's why we give it to the best person within a radius before the tissue goes bad. And essentially what this paper does is we designed some nanoparticles in my group that you can combine with cryopreservative molecules. And essentially, you can pump it through an organ after it's been donated, vitrify it as usual. And then instead of having to warm it up in the typical fashion, you can actually apply radio frequency energy. And actually, all of our tissue is completely permeant to radio frequency. So you can essentially uniformly rewarm the tissue, avoiding all of that tissue damage. And so some postdocs and graduate students and even undergraduates in my group designed these particles. And it's not work just my group does. It's actually also with 3 different faculty collaborators in other departments. But we showed that we could essentially vitrify and rewarm mammalian tissue and that the recovered tissue is healthy and functional. And this got a ton of news press this week. I mean, it was on CNN even, for example. And so it's super exciting to me that we might enable much better tissue and organ matches and that it's nanoparticles and the really unusual properties that come with them that make it possible.
Well, this is an amazing success. Congratulations, Christy.
Thanks.
And I know it solves a critical problem in healthcare, as you mentioned. I'm curious, how long did it take for this project to go from inception, when you were first coming up with these ideas, to the publication?
Kind of a long time, I'll say. So maybe 5 years ago is when I kind of started working with my collaborators. So John Bischoff is a professor in mechanical engineering. Mike Garwood is a professor that leads our Center for Magnetic Resonance Research. The 3 of us were working together on designing nanoparticles that would enable biomedical imaging, so doing some magnetic resonance imaging. We weren't even thinking about heating tissue at the time. But my group was working really hard on making these stable superparamagnetic iron oxide particles that required a very particular coating, because usually when you put nanoparticles into a complex matrix, something that's got proteins and high ionic strength, their natural state is to aggregate and then fall out of solution. And if that happens in your bloodstream, that would be really bad.
Right, that's a problem.
So my group really worked hard on creating a stable coating that would let this nanoparticle do its job, even in complex environments. And we published a couple papers on that. We've written a lot of grants. We started working with some small companies that were interested in this. And then this idea of using the fact that you can use radio frequency to cause these same superparamagnetic iron oxide cores to heat brought us to thinking about this cryopreservation and organ rewarming. And it's a hugely collaborative effort. I certainly had never been thinking about organ rewarming, but that's a great thing about working with interdisciplinary teams is things that are easy for me are hard for someone else, and the things that are easy for them are hard for me. And when you put it together, we can get a lot more done. So it's been like a 5-year arc so far. And actually, we just heard recently that our NIH R01 grant, which is the grant everyone covets, scored well enough that it's probably going to be funded to kind of expand this work. So make more particles, work in larger organs, actually work with a surgeon that will eventually re-implant an organ, do a xenotransplantation into an animal and show that the organ is still fully functional. So it's got a long way to go, but it's really exciting. The students that do this work and the postdocs that do this work, I mean, they are, of course, really the hands that make it happen and the brains that make it happen. And sometimes I get a little bit frustrated, actually, at how much credit faculty get and how often you don't hear the student names, the postdoc names in these news stories. So I just want to make sure that, I don't know, I hope any graduate students or postdocs listening know how much the faculty appreciate the hard work that goes into all the recognition that kind of keeps a research group moving forward.
And I think when we use that scientific we really mean it. It is a whole group effort, like you said.
Absolutely.
So thanks so much for sharing this project. It sounds amazing and a wonderful story of success to share with our listeners today. We are going to take a break a little bit from the scientific side and dive into the wonderful world of literature here. Christy, can you tell us, is there a book that you've read that you've really enjoyed that you want to share with our listeners today as a recommendation?
I thought of 2 books, so I'm breaking your rule a little bit. And maybe they're not books anybody's ever suggested before on these kinds of interviews. I picked a long-term favorite first, which maybe a lot of people have read, called Guns, Germs, and Steel. This is written by Jared Diamond, and I read this book a lot of years ago, but I could reread it a ton of times. So the book is essentially a study about how biological and geographic and environmental factors, among other things, shaped the way we populated the planet and the societies that developed. I loved the kind of impressive synthesis of ideas from so many different fields to kind of go after big history, big questions. The more recent favorite is actually a book I just finished in the last month, and I think maybe a lot of people have read it because it's on the bestseller list. It's called Underground Railroad, written by Colson Whitehead. It has nothing to do with science. It's essentially a fictionalized story related to slave life in the United States before the Civil War, and parts of it are really hard to read because the treatment of slaves was so inhumane. But the character development is really well done, and I think that the accessibility of the book, of the story, has brought a lot of attention to a really important and dark part of our country's history. And I personally think that people like me who enjoy considerable privilege have an obligation to understand how I secured that privilege. And so while very different books, and neither of them particularly chemistry-y, I think they're both important books to read.
Certainly. Excellent recommendations. And I actually hadn't come across the latter, so I'm glad you brought it up today. We'll add it to our list. So I know we've talked about a lot of wonderful aspects of your career, Christy, as a scientist, but we haven't yet really touched on travel. And I think this is a huge part of the life of a scientist. So is there one place that you can think of that was just your absolute favorite that science has taken you that you can tell us about?
I'm torn on this one because travel and knowing people all over the world is definitely one of the great benefits of academic science. One option would be a trip I took to Italy in 2010 for a scientific conference. And usually my spouse doesn't travel with me when I go on professional travel, but he and I actually went to Italy a week early and enjoyed Tuscany and Florence and Cinque Terre, just had a beautiful time. I was a relatively new mom. This was my first big trip away from my son, who was 14 months old at the time. And after all that travel for a week, my husband went home with a suitcase full of Chianti while I stayed and had no jet lag for this microfluidics conference. So the food was amazing. The downtime with my spouse was amazing. The science was amazing. So it's hard to top something like that. But I think another option I would be remiss not to mention, and that maybe more of your listeners can identify with, would be when I attended my very first scientific conference and simultaneously had my first trip out of the United States. When I was a second-year graduate student, I went to a conference in China. It was actually a two-part conference. The first few days was in Xiamen, which is kind of a less visited part of China, and then the second half was in Beijing proper. And I was completely blown away by the culture, and it was really the first time that I saw how the scientific community comes together and communicates. And then, I'm sorry you asked for one, but I'm going to give you one more. Because one other strong thing, I was brainstorming what it would be. It's very hard for me to choose.
Good things comes in three, so it's okay. Yeah.
So it was a conference I attended in Budapest in 2002. It was the first time that I presented a talk to a room full of people and realized that I wasn't nervous about it. So it was a really important milestone of, oh, yeah, I've got this. I'm becoming an expert on this topic. It was also an important trip because I was chatting with somebody who's not my advisor that I kind of knew casually from the scientific network. And it was while I was sitting with him on top of a mountain in Budapest, kind of looking down at the city, that I decided I would apply for faculty positions at research institutions. So 3 answers, but you can see why they're all important.
Absolutely. Well, you've taken us to Italy, China, and Budapest, so I'm impressed here. Well, Erin, I think throughout your career as a scientist, not only do you get to see wonderful places, but you get to work with amazing people. And I think the human side of science is sometimes underappreciated, or there's stereotypes about what scientists are like. And we love to show this human side of science on our show. So can you share with us maybe a quirky tradition that you experienced in one laboratory, or just a funny or fond memory you've shared with other scientists?
Yeah, sure. My research group of roughly 20 people, like I mentioned, tends to be a really social, collaborative group. And of course, labs go through stages and traditions come in and out, but there are a few lab traditions that kind of stick with my group. So every year we go as a group to the Minnesota State Fair, which if you haven't been to it, it is a phenomenon. It is the largest state fair, and every year we do something silly like build a vegetable car race or a cow milking something. One year my group participated in a cottage cheese eating contest.
Oh, gosh.
So the state fair in and of itself is quirky, and we go every year. We also have typically a pie bake-off every summer. Right when our summer students are getting ready to leave, we have an undergraduate research symposium, and everybody bakes a pie, and we bring people in and do blind tasting and score them. I have not won yet, but I bake a pie every year. Then we do lots of other things. I mean, this last summer, my group actually taught my 8-year-old how to play Pokemon Go. So we spent a lot of time wandering around the campus catching Pokemon. And I will say in general, my group is a game playing group. We like to get together and play all kinds of board games. And my group is really amazing about including my kids in those activities, which I really appreciate.
That's fantastic. So what's your favorite board game?
A current favorite in my house right now is Pandemic. It's a cooperative game, so it's not one team versus another. Everybody plays together, and your goal is to essentially save the world before a pandemic breaks out.
It's a worthy cause, I will say.
Yeah, it's a really fun game, and my 8-year-old really loves it, despite the fact that it's astoundingly complicated.
Well, that is amazing. And it sounds like you have just a wonderful research group there and a wonderful environment for everyone to conduct research in and kind of get to know each other, even outside of the scientific context as well.
Yeah, I will often say that by far the best thing about working for me is that you get to be with my group. They're amazing.
I love it. You can just sense the appreciation. And I think going back to our conversation earlier, that science is a group endeavor. It is really this team mentality that I think is so important for productivity and having that good work environment.
Yeah, when I think about what my job is, I'm sure I have colleagues that would maybe disapprove of this. I don't think of the scientific output as being the primary thing that I'm aiming for. I think of it as developing the next generation of scientific leaders. And what that means is that with each graduate student or postdoc, my job is really to figure out what's the one or two big kind of changes that would let this person kind of reach a bigger potential. And it's different, of course, for every person. And my general feeling is that if you have a group that's happy and working together, that the good science is an automatic byproduct of that. And so far, I'll say that that is borne out for me.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like you've got the scientific dream team already in place. And I'm curious, Christy, if you were able to, maybe along with your dream team, answer any question in science, and this can be absolutely anything. Think about if we were to give you all the funding, staff, technology, feasibility, whatever you would need to answer this question, what would you want to tackle?
I was trying to think about things that would have really broad impact. And so one potential thing would be to create an inexpensive, simple, non-invasive measurement method that would identify the chemical identity of single or small number of molecules, even when in a complex environment. So if you had this magical sensing machine, you could imagine sensing low levels of toxin or parasite in blood. You could imagine detecting allergens in food. It would essentially contribute greatly to all kinds of disease detection and all kinds of other applications. So that's what I picked, but it's really hard for me to narrow down on that, actually.
Yeah, I think we're so often limited by all these constraints. It's hard to completely take all the bars off here. So now, Christy, we've talked about some of the people who've impacted you over the course of your career and how you have this wonderful mentoring relationship with the people in your group. I'm curious, is there one piece of advice that you've received either from a student or a faculty member or one of your colleagues that really had a big impact on you that you want to pass on to our listeners today?
I think that maybe especially early in your career as a faculty member, you get invited to do things and they're great things, or to go places that are great places, or to meet people that are great people. And you don't want to say no because you think somebody's given me this opportunity. There are so many people that would want this opportunity, but you really can't realistically fit it into your life for whatever reason. It's okay to say no to that because chances are you'll be asked to do whatever it is or go wherever it is again in the future. In general, those opportunities are not lost. And so I think keeping that in mind is a good idea. I tend to be somebody that before I had my first child, I scheduled lots of things. I was really good at keeping a schedule. I got a lot done. I was really efficient. And I thought having a baby, it was just going to be something else that slotted in to my schedule. And that is totally untrue. Anybody who's had a kid knows that. Right. Your schedule is no longer your own. You don't get to decide how they slot in. That was a good reality check for me and made me think more about things like this, that there are some things you're going to say no to, and it doesn't mean that opportunity is lost.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. You have to appreciate that no matter how efficient and organized you are in your life, you really can't do everything. So you're ultimately going to have to say no to some things. You just have to decide what makes the most sense at the moment.
Yeah. And I think a lot now about where I can have a unique impact. If I'm thinking, oh, I should do this, I have to ask myself sometimes, am I really the only person that can do this and have the impact that needs to be had? Or would it be okay to have somebody else do it this time? I think right now we live in a culture where it's really easy to mistake busyness for importance. And I think I did that for a really long time. I thought, wow, I'm so busy. That must mean I'm really important. And I realized that I've turned a corner in my life where the people that are my mentees or my kids, they don't need me to be important by being busy. they need me to be really kind of focused on whatever they need. And so I'm trying to shed some of the busyness for those kind of higher quality levels of attention on a smaller number of things.
Absolutely. Well, excellent message to pass on to our listeners, Christy. Can you tell them, is there any other last piece of inspiration or a last piece of advice you want to leave them with?
Yeah, I think everybody who finishes a master's degree or a PhD in chemistry or any other field, of course, becomes an expert on whatever's in that big thesis. So everybody that graduates is going to be an expert in something. The thing that's going to make the difference when you go out to get whatever job it is that you want, it may be that science, but it's probably not going to be that. It's probably going to be all of the other skills that you build around that, things that would be kind of more soft skills. So I think it's actually really important when you're in graduate school to be thinking not just about how many experiments, how many papers, but to be thinking at the same time about developing good communication skills or mentorship skills or managing skills or any of these other things. And so I try really hard to think about that. Actually, my group during the summertime, they like the fact that once a month we have what we call non-traditional group meetings. So instead of somebody presenting science and us all asking questions, we talk about something else. We talk about something that's related to, for example, implicit bias or imposter syndrome, or how to avoid pseudoscience when you're talking to a general audience. We talk about a lot of kind of soft skills. And I think that often that is really going to be the distinguishing factor that figures out whether you get the job or whether your competitor does.
Definitely. Well, I love this idea of non-traditional group meetings, and I think you're absolutely right. You can't underestimate the value of these soft skills as you're going into interviews and things like that later on in your career. So thank you for sharing that advice with our listeners today. And Christy, can you tell them if they want to learn more about you or your work or get in touch with you, where should they go?
So my research group has a website, which we keep up to date. If you just look up Haynes Research Group at University of Minnesota, you'll find it. All of our papers are there, for example. My email address is there if you want to contact me. You could also look up the Haynes Research Group on Facebook and follow us if you like. We post a lot of stuff. And I mentioned that Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology in one of my earlier answers when I was talking about work I was really excited about and those nanoscale battery materials. That center actually has a blog where the students and the faculty write about lots of things related to sustainability and nanoparticles that we'd love the listeners to follow. So that's at sustainable-nano.com.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out Christy's lab website and this Sustainable Nanoscience blog. They sound like excellent resources. And now, Christy, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
It's been a pleasure. I hope it's useful for listeners.
Definitely. Well, it has been so much fun to meet you and learn more about your work. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.